Hey, it's Nathan. I want to start tonight with a question that sounds simple until you actually sit in it. If a stranger called you at 11 at night and told you your child was standing in an airport 4 hours from home, and then you walked upstairs and found your child asleep in her own bed, what would you do next? Most people would hang up. A few would panic. Almost nobody would do what the man in this story did, which was to stand very still, look at the phone, and start counting the things that didn't add up. His name is Callum, and he spent his whole career doing one strange, unglamorous job, proving that when an airline hands a child from one adult to another, the handoff is real. Every signature, every timestamp, every camera. He was the guy the airlines hired to find the gaps. So when a little girl showed up at gate 12 holding a laminated photo of his face, he didn't see a miracle or a mistake. He saw a document. And documents, he liked to say, always tell you who wrote them. What I love about this one is that it never becomes a story about a man swinging his fists. It stays a story about a man reading the fine print, and the people who forgot that the quiet ones are the ones who keep the receipts. Stick with me all the way to the end, because the last handoff he signs is the one that made me put my coffee down. Let's get into it. The phone rang at 11:04 on a Tuesday, and Callum Alcott knew before he answered that it was going to be one of two kinds of calls. The good kind came from his sister in Oregon, who never checked the time zones. The bad kind came from numbers he didn't recognize, and this was a number he didn't recognize. An 800 line with the polite gray anonymity of a corporation. He muted the ball game, set his mug on the coaster his daughter had painted him for Father's Day, and answered on the third ring the way he answered everything, evenly. This is Callum. Good evening, sir. I'm calling from Meridian Air Passenger Services. Am I speaking with Callum Alcott, spelled A-L-C-O-T-T? The woman had the flat cadence of someone reading from a screen, and Callum's ear, trained over 15 years to hear when a script was being followed, noted that she had spelled his name for him rather than asking him to confirm it. That was backward. You confirm identity by making the customer volunteer the detail. You don't feed it to them. That's me, he said. What's this about? Sir, I'm calling about your daughter. Her flight arrived into Halford International at 6:52 this evening, and she's been waiting at gate B12 for a little over 4 hours now. Our unaccompanied minor team has kept her comfortable, but we do need a guardian to complete the release. We've tried the primary contact number several times. Callum looked up at the ceiling. Directly above him, in the small blue room with the glow star stickers he'd never quite gotten off the paint, his daughter Emmy was asleep. He had tucked her in at 9. He had read her 2 chapters of the dog book, and she had made him do the growly voice. And then she had told him his growl was getting better but still too nice. And then she had fallen asleep with one sock on. He was, at that moment, looking at the base of the stairs, and he could see the nightlight spilling out from under her door. You have the wrong Alcott, he said. My daughter is asleep upstairs. I'm looking at her door right now. There was a pause, and in the pause, he heard the thing he would later describe to a federal agent as the tell. It wasn't confusion. When you tell a customer service agent they've made an error, you get a little scramble, a little apology, the rustle of somebody clicking to a different record. What he got instead was a smoothness, a readiness, as if the objection had been anticipated, and a response preloaded. Sir, I understand this is upsetting, she said, but the minor in our care has your phone number listed as her guardian contact. She has your home address on her paperwork, and she's carrying a photograph of you. She's been showing it to our staff all evening, telling them her dad is coming. A beat. We really do need you to come to the airport and complete the release, Mr. Alcott. If a guardian doesn't claim her within the hour, our policy requires us to involve airport police and child protective services. I'm sure you'd rather this not become a police matter. He didn't answer right away. He was a man who had learned, in rooms full of lawyers and logistics managers, that the person who fills a silence loses it. So he let the silence sit, and while it sat, he did 3 things. He wrote down the exact time. He wrote down the flight details she'd given. Halford International, 6:52, gate B12, in the small notebook he kept by the couch out of a habit older than his marriage. And he thought, very clearly, about the sentence she had chosen to end on. She had not said, "We're worried about the child." She had said, "I'm sure you'd rather this not become a police matter." She had put the threat of police in his lap, and called it a courtesy. "Give me the flight number," Callum said. "I'm not able to release flight specifics over the phone, sir. But if you come to the Meridian Air Service desk at Halford, Concourse B, we can complete everything there." "Right," he said. "Thank you." And he hung up, because he had gotten what he needed, which was the confirmation that whoever this was did not want him asking questions on a recorded line. They wanted him in a car, alone, driving toward a decision he hadn't thought through. He went upstairs first. He would tell people, afterward, that this was the only truly irrational thing he did all night, because he knew Emmy was up there, and he had just told the caller so. But knowing is not the same as seeing, and there is a specific animal part of a parent's brain that does not accept the word of a stranger about the safety of a child. He opened her door slowly so the hinge wouldn't creak. She was exactly where he'd left her, sprawled diagonal across the bed the way she always ended up. One sock on, the dog book tented on the floor where it had slid. Her breathing was the slow tide he had listened for through every fever of her 9 years. He stood there for the length of one long breath, and then he did something that surprised even him. He took out his phone and photographed the clock on her nightstand, 11:11, and then her sleeping face, time-stamped, because some cold, clear part of him had already understood that tonight he might need to prove where his daughter was, and when. Then he went back downstairs and started building the case. To understand what Callum did next, and why almost no one else would have done it, you have to understand what he did for a living, because it was the kind of job people's eyes glazed over at parties, right up until the night it saved a child's life. Callum Alcott audited the handoff of human beings. That's not how his business cards put it. His card said Alcott Chain of Custody Consulting, and under that, in smaller letters, Unaccompanied Minor and Interline Handoff Assurance. What it meant in plain language was this: when an airline lets a parent put a 7-year-old on a plane alone, that airline promises to walk the child from the departing adult, through the terminal, onto the aircraft, off the aircraft, through the arrival airport, and into the arms of exactly the right adult at the other end. No substitutions. Every leg of that journey is supposed to generate a record, a wristband scanned, a form signed, a photo ID checked against a name, a camera catching the moment of release. Airlines are supposed to be able to prove, later, that the child never once passed through an unwitnessed gap. Callum was the man they hired to prove they couldn't. He had started as an irregular operations investigator for a legacy carrier, the person who got the 2 a.m. call when a bag went to Manila, or a passenger missed a connection, or, twice in his career, a child ended up somewhere no one could immediately account for. The first time it happened, a 9-year-old boy routed through a hub during a thunderstorm, handed off between 2 gate agents who each assumed the other had him, found 90 minutes later asleep under a jet bridge desk, unharmed and unbothered and utterly invisibly off the record. Callum had gone home and not slept. Not because the boy was hurt, because for 90 minutes, the most sophisticated logistics network humanity had ever built had held a child in its hands and had no idea. If the network could lose a child by accident, he had thought, lying awake, then the network could lose a child on purpose, and it would look exactly the same. He had spent the 15 years since making that thought his profession. He stress-tested the systems. He walked fake children, data ghosts, he called them, complete minor records he inserted with the carrier's permission, through real terminals to see where they fell out of the record. He wrote reports that made vice presidents unhappy. He was very good, and he was very calm, and he was, by the design of his own careful life, almost impossible to rattle, because he had built his entire adult identity around the belief that panic is just information you refuse to organize. The panic he had earned the right to feel he'd spent 3 years ago when Colleen died, his wife, a pulmonary embolism, sudden and stupid and unfair, on an ordinary Thursday while she was standing at the kitchen counter cutting the crusts off Emmy's sandwich. There is no audit for that. There is no gap you can close, no signature that would have caught it. Callum had come out the other side of that year a quieter man and a fiercer father, a man who understood in his bones that the world will hand you a loss you cannot document, and there is nothing to do but carry it. He had one job left that mattered, and she was asleep upstairs with one sock on. So when he decided to drive to the airport, it was not a father rushing blindly toward a child in distress. It was an auditor, deciding to inspect a discrepancy in person, on site, before anyone could clean it up. But he was still a father, which is why he did not leave his own daughter alone in the house at midnight to do it. He called Pauline. Pauline Ott lived 2 doors down, a retired flight attendant in her 70s who had flown the North Atlantic in the days when the job meant something closer to soldiering than serving, and who had adopted Callum and Emmy after Colleen died with the brisk, unsentimental competence of a woman who had handled emergencies at 40,000 feet. She answered on the second ring, awake, because people like Pauline are always a little awake. "It's Callum," he said. "I need to go to Halford tonight, and I need someone with Emmy. I'll explain when you're here. Bring your reading glasses. I might need you to look at some paperwork with me later." "Give me 4 minutes," Pauline said, and hung up, and that was the whole conversation. And that was why he loved her. While he waited, he did what he always did. He organized. He printed, from his home office, his own current whereabouts. He was not a paranoid man, but he was a thorough one, and it took 90 seconds to generate a document showing that his phone had been on his home network all evening. He photographed Emmy's medications, her school folder, the fridge calendar with her spelling test circled for Thursday, the ordinary sediment of a real child's real life, proof that the daughter he actually had was a documented, witnessed, established human being with a dentist appointment. Whoever had put his name on a stranger's paperwork had built a fiction. Callum's defense, he understood already, was going to be the truth, densely recorded. Pauline arrived in a raincoat over her nightgown and took one look at his face. "Whose child is at the airport, Callum?" "That," he said, pulling on his jacket, "is the question I'm driving there to answer." He kissed the top of Emmy's head without waking her, told Pauline to lock the deadbolt and not open the door for anyone who wasn't him, and went out into the dark. The drive to Halford took him 50 minutes on empty interstate, and somewhere around the 30-minute mark he became aware of the sedan. It was 2 cars back, a dark late-model something with the anonymous competence of a rental, and it had been there since the on-ramp. Callum did not speed up or slow down. He changed lanes without signaling, drifted to the exit for a truck stop, took it, pulled into the fuel island, and watched in his mirror as the sedan passed the exit and continued north toward the airport without him. He sat there for a moment with his hands on the wheel. Maybe it was nothing. He'd spent a career learning that most anomalies are noise, but he'd also spent a career learning that the ones that matter feel exactly like the ones that don't, right up until they don't. He bought a bad coffee he didn't want so the stop would look ordinary, and he got back on the road, and he called no one, because there was no one yet to call who would believe him. He had a sleeping daughter, a photographed clock, a stranger's threat, and the growing, cold water certainty that he was driving into something that had been built specifically for him. He was right about that. He was wrong only about the shape of it, and the shape was worse than he guessed. Halford International at midnight is a strange, half-lit country. The retail is shuttered. The moving walkways run for no one. The great windows show only the reflection of the terminal back at itself, and the arrivals boards have gone quiet. All the day's flights faded to a few red, delayed and canceled entries hanging like accusations. Callum parked in the hourly garage, photographed his ticket and the time, and walked into Concourse B past a janitor buffing an already clean floor. He did not go to the Meridian Air Service desk. He went to Gate B12 directly, because he wanted to see the child before anyone saw him seeing her. She was small. That was the first thing, the thing that went in under his ribs and stayed there. She was maybe 8, in a purple coat too light for the season, sitting in the middle of a whole empty bank of gate seats with her feet not reaching the floor, and she was holding, in both hands, the way you hold something you have been told is precious, a laminated 4x6 photograph. Even from 30 feet, in the dead terminal light, Callum could see that the photograph was of him, his face, a candid shot, slightly grainy, the kind of picture taken from a distance without the subject's knowledge. He was on his own front step in it, reaching for the door, and the angle was from across the street. A woman in a Meridian Air supervisor's blazer stood a few feet from the child, and she saw Callum before the child did. Her name tag said Marla Duggan, supervisor, and her face did a thing that Callum had seen exactly twice before in his life, both times on people who were about to lie to him professionally. Relief, arriving a half-second before it should have. She knew him on sight. She had never met him. She knew him because she had been shown a photograph too. Mr. Alcott, Marla said, coming toward him with her hand out and her voice pitched warm. Thank goodness, she's been so brave. Let's get you both home. And she had a clipboard already turned toward him, a pen already uncapped, a form with a signature line already highlighted in yellow. And Callum understood, in the length of time it took him to not take the pen, that everything about this had been arranged so that the only unscripted action left in the entire scene was his signature at the bottom. He did not take the pen. He looked at the child instead. She had turned at the sound of his name, and she was looking up at him with an expression he would not be able to shake for a long time. A careful, rehearsed hope. A hope she had been coached into, watching his face to see if she'd gotten it right. Are you my new dad? She asked. Her voice was small and even. They said if I was good and I waited, my new dad would come and get me. She held up the photograph, comparing it to his face, checking her work. It's you, she said, with a relief so total it broke something in him. It's really you. Callum crouched down slowly, the way he'd learned to talk to frightened 7-year-olds in loud terminals, so his eyes came level with hers. What's your name? He asked gently. The child's careful hope flickered. This was off script. They said, she started, and looked at Marla, and Marla said too quickly, her name's on the paperwork, Mr. Alcott. It's all right there. Why don't we just… I'm asking her, Callum said, still gentle, still crouched, not looking at Marla at all. And to the girl, you don't have to know the right answer. There isn't one. I just want to know your name, the one you had before anybody gave you a photograph. The girl's chin trembled. Freya, she whispered, like she was confessing. But I'm not supposed to say that one anymore. Callum kept his face kind and his voice level, and inside, every alarm he had was going off at once, cold and clean. Because a child who has been instructed which of her own names she is allowed to say is not a lost passenger. She is cargo that has been relabeled. And a supervisor who tries to answer for the child, who has the form pre-highlighted, who knew his face before he arrived, that is not an airline making an error. That is an airline employee executing a delivery. He stood back up. Ms. Duggan, he said pleasantly, I'm going to need the interline handoff record, the departure station's release form, the escort's identification and duty log, the wristband scan history, and the guardian authorization document with the notary block. All of it. Before anyone signs anything. He watched her face do the arithmetic. He watched her realize that the one man in the country you did not want to hand a laundered child to, the one man whose entire profession was the reconstruction of exactly this kind of chain, was the man whose name was on the paperwork. Somebody upstream had made a catastrophic mistake. They had chosen their patsy from a list, and the list had not told them what he did for a living. I don't think that's necessary, Marla said, and her warmth was gone now, replaced by the brittle authority of someone whose script had run out. The release is straightforward. If you're refusing to take custody of your own daughter, sir, I'm obligated to call. Call them, Callum said. Please, call airport police, call Child Protective Services, call everyone. He took out his phone and, holding it up so she could see, started recording. Video, wide, catching the gate number, the child, the supervisor, the clipboard, the highlighted signature line. My name is Callum Alcott. It is 12:41 a.m. I am at gate B12, Halford International. This child is not my daughter. My daughter is asleep at home, and I have time-stamped photographs to prove it. I have been called here under a pretext. My photograph has been taken of my home without my knowledge, and I am being pressured to sign a custody release for a minor named Freya, whose paperwork I have not been allowed to inspect. I am not signing anything. I am reporting this, right now, on the record. He turned the camera to Marla's name tag, held it, then to the guardian letter clipped to her board, close enough to read the notary stamp before she jerked it away. The whole trap, he understood, had depended on him being a normal, terrified father who would sign to make it stop and take the child home and become, by dawn, a man found with a trafficked minor in his house. His name, his address, his photograph, all pre-planted to make it airtight. They had not built a kidnapping. They had built a frame, and the child was the bait. And the moment his signature hit that line, the jaws would close. So he did the one thing the architecture of the trap could not absorb. Instead of quietly taking the bait or quietly refusing it, He stood in the middle of the dead terminal and made the whole thing loud and documented and impossible to disappear. He turned their delivery into a witnessed event. And somewhere in a downtown office, a man named Alistair Payne was about to be told that the auditor had not signed. The airport police who arrived 20 minutes later were 2 officers and a sergeant, and Callum clocked the sergeant as a problem before the man opened his mouth. Sergeant Elmore Cask was heavyset and unhurried, and he came in already treating Callum as the subject rather than the reporting party, which told Callum that Cask had been briefed before he arrived, that someone had gotten to a phone faster than 911. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stop recording and step over here," Cask said, and Callum did not stop recording, and said, evenly, "Sergeant, I'm the person who called this in. I'm happy to give a full statement. I'd like your name and badge number for my report, and I'd like it noted that the child has told me her name is Freya and that she's been instructed not to use it." He watched Cask try to take control of the paperwork, reaching for Marla's clipboard, saying he'd secure the documents, which is exactly what you say when you intend to make documents unavailable. Callum had already photographed every page. He had the Guardian authorization letter naming Callum Alcott as receiving guardian, notarized with a stamp reading Byron Teller, Notary Public, and a commission number. He had the medical clearance, a fit-to-travel form for the minor, signed with a looping V, Skaggs, MD. He had the unaccompanied minor manifest, and on the manifest, where the child's name should have been, was a code, Bridge 46, not a name, a number, and a word. And Callum, who had read 10,000 manifests, felt the number land like a stone, because a manifest that codes a child as inventory is a manifest written by people who move a lot of children and need to keep them straight. What saved the night was that Callum did not let the child out of his sight and did not let the documents out of the record. He kept his phone up. He asked, repeatedly and clearly, for a CPS caseworker and a supervisor from a different agency, naming them, creating a paper trail of his own requests. When Cask tried to take Freya into protective custody himself, Callum said, loudly enough for the officers to hear, "Sergeant, I want it on record that I've requested this child be released to a licensed child protective services worker, not to airport police, and that I'm concerned about the integrity of the handoff." He was using their own language against them, chain of custody, integrity of the handoff, and the 2 young officers, who were not in on anything, began to look at their sergeant differently. That was the crack. Corruption survives in the dark and dies a little every time an honest cop starts wondering. When the CPS worker finally arrived, a tired, decent woman named Renelle who took one look at Bridge 46 and went pale, Freya was released to her, properly, with Callum's video running the whole time, and Callum drove home at 4 a.m. having taken custody of nothing but 41 photographs and a name, Freya. He got 2 hours of sleep. Then he made Emmy her waffles, walked her to the corner where the Nowak twins waited for the bus, waved until she was on it, came home, and spread the 41 photographs across his dining table like a hand of cards. This was the work he knew how to do. A stranger might see chaos. Callum saw a document set, and a document set has an author, and an author has a habit, and a habit is a trail. He started with the notary. Byron Teller's commission number was real. He checked it against the state registry, but the commission had been issued only 14 months ago and was attached to a residential address, not a title company or a law office. A brand new notary working out of a house, whose stamp appeared on a forged child guardianship letter, was not a coincidence. He was a supplier. Callum set Teller aside as a thread to pull later. He moved to the medical clearance. V. Skaggs, MD. A search returned a Dr. Verona Skaggs, whose medical license had been suspended 2 years ago and quietly reinstated on probation, and who was currently listed as medical consultant for a nonprofit. The nonprofit's name was the Wayfair Foundation. Callum sat back. He knew that name, not from the news, though the Wayfair Foundation was in the news. Glossy, celebrated. The kind of charity that bought naming rights on a children's hospital wing. He knew it from his own work. 8 months earlier, he'd been contracted by Meridian Air's compliance division to audit their unaccompanied minor program after an internal flag. And buried in that audit, he had found a pattern he'd written up in dry, careful language. A recurring set of bookings whose receiving guardians could not be independently verified. Phantom guardians, he'd called them. Adults whose identities checked out on paper but who, when his team tried to confirm them by an independent channel, evaporated. He'd flagged 19 such bookings over a 2-year window and recommended a full forensic review. The bookings had one connective thread that he'd noted and not understood. They'd all been arranged through a reunification services partner, a charity that helped place children with families across state and national lines. The Wayfair Foundation. He'd filed the finding. Compliance had thanked him and told him it was under review. And then, he realized now, sitting at his dining table with cold coffee, nothing had happened, because someone at Wayfair had learned that an auditor had put 19 of their shipments in a report and had decided to make the auditor go away. That was why him. Not random. He wasn't a name pulled from a list of clean profiles. He was a specific man who had specifically, if unknowingly, threatened a specific pipeline, and Alistair Payne had reached out through the machine and tried to bury him under the very cargo he'd flagged. Deliver a laundered child to the auditor's own custody, using the auditor's own name and photo, then let airport police discover it, and the auditor becomes a monster. The report becomes the paranoid work of a man who was himself trafficking children, and the pipeline goes back to running clean. It was, Callum thought with a professional's grim admiration, elegant. It had exactly one flaw. It required the auditor to sign. He needed to understand the whole shape of it before he moved, because a man who has been framed once will be framed again, better, if he shows his hand early. So he did what he was best at. He reconstructed the chain. He took Bridge 46 and the 19 Phantom Guardian bookings from his old audit and laid them against each other, and the routing pattern matched. The same clustering of hub cities, the same off-peak red-eye legs where terminals were empty and supervisors worked alone, the same reunification partner. Wayfair wasn't placing children with families. Wayfair was moving children, foster children, mostly, kids the system had lost track of, children whose files had been closed with the words placed out of jurisdiction or adopted internationally, the bureaucratic phrases that make a child stop being anyone's problem. And once a child had been declared placed somewhere far away, no one looked for them again. The system's own paperwork became the perfect camouflage. Wayfair took children the state had officially stopped counting, moved them by air as unaccompanied minors on forged guardianship letters, and delivered them to whoever had paid, for a private adoption with no court, for the child's own benefits and trust funds redirected to new guardians. For reasons Callum made himself think about clearly, because looking away is how these things survive. The Wayfair Foundation had a face, and the face was extraordinary. Alistair Payne was silver-haired and warm, and photographed constantly with children on his knee. He gave a talk. Callum found it, watched all 18 minutes of it that night, titled, "Every Child Deserves a Bridge Home," in which Payne, voice cracking at the right moments, described the Foundation's mission to reunite hard-to-place children with forever families across borders that ordinary agencies couldn't cross. He was applauded. He was, the internet informed Callum, up for a humanitarian award. He had built the single most effective camouflage a child trafficking operation could have. He had made the trafficking indistinguishable from charity, and he had made himself indistinguishable from a saint, and every dollar of goodwill was a wall between him and a man with 41 photographs. Callum understood, watching Payne dab his eyes on stage, that he could not win this the way he'd stopped the frame at the gate, with volume and a phone camera. Payne was too clean, too beloved, too lawyered. If Callum went to the press with photographs of a manifest, Payne's people would produce a tearful explanation, a rogue employee, a clerical tragedy, and Callum, the man airport police had already been briefed to treat as a subject, would be the unstable auditor with a grudge. No. To take down a man who had weaponized paperwork, you did not shout. You audited him. You reconstructed his chain of custody so completely that every signature and every timestamp pointed at him and could not be delegated away. And to do that, Callum needed two things he didn't have: someone on the inside and someone with a badge who could make an arrest that the bot sergeant couldn't smother. The inside came to him. Her name was Sabra Linden, and she was 23, and she was a family coordinator at the Wayfair Foundation, which meant she was the person who booked the flights and comforted the children and told them about their new families, and she had stopped sleeping months ago. She found Callum because Callum, carefully, had let himself be findable. He'd filed a formal complaint with the state charities regulator naming Wayfair, knowing it would circulate internally, knowing that somewhere in that beautiful, rotten organization there might be one person waiting for a reason. Sabra was that person. She emailed him from an account she'd made at a library. "You're the man from Gate 12, she wrote. "Freya was Bridge 46. I booked her flight. I've been telling myself they really do find families. I stopped being able to tell myself that. I have copies of things. I don't know what to do, and I'm scared they'll know it was me. Please tell me you're what you look like and not another one of them." They met in the reference section of that same library, among the tax guides, because Sabra had chosen a place with cameras and exits and no Wayfair connection, which told Callum she was smart and had thought about being followed, which told him she was worth protecting. She was thin and exhausted and furious in the specific way of a young person who has watched adults do something monstrous while calling it kindness. She had, on an encrypted drive, the thing Callum needed most, the bridge ledger. Wayfair kept it as an internal spreadsheet, a coordination tool disguised as a case management system, and it listed the children by their bridge numbers, Bridge 1 through Bridge 51, with columns for origin jurisdiction, closure code, transit routing, receiving party, and a field labeled, with the banal horror of the bureaucratic mind, disposition. Freya was Bridge 46, and Bridge 46 was not the first, and if Callum did not move fast, she would not be the last. The ledger showed 2 more transfers scheduled in the coming weeks. "They think they scared you off," Sabra said. After the airport, Mr. Payne told the coordinators there was an incident with an uncooperative placement and that it was handled. "They think you took the child, panicked, and disappeared. They don't know you kept the paperwork." She looked at him. "You kept the paperwork, right?" "I kept all of it," Callum said. "Sabra, I need you to understand what I'm going to ask you to do, because it's dangerous, and you can say no." He laid it out. He didn't need her to blow a whistle and run. Whistles get discredited. He needed her to stay exactly where she was, keep booking flights, keep her access, and help him do the one thing that would end this cleanly. Turn Wayfair's own delivery system into a trap that the Foundation's leadership would walk into on the record. Sabra was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Bridge 47 is a boy, 8 years old. He's scheduled in 11 days. And Callum knew she was in, because she had already started counting the way he counted. In children, not in risk. The badge was harder, and it came from his own past. Malachi Sawande had been a young airline security liaison back when Callum was an irregular ops investigator, and the two of them had spent one very long night in an operations center a decade ago tracking down whether a missing juvenile passenger had been abducted or had simply, terrifyingly, wandered. She'd wandered, and they'd found her, and something had passed between the two men that night, a shared understanding of the stakes hiding inside the boring machinery of aviation. Malachi had gone federal. He was now a special agent with Homeland Security Investigations, working exactly the kind of case Callum had stumbled into. And when Callum called him and said, "I need to buy you breakfast and show you a spreadsheet," Malachi heard something in his old friend's voice and cleared his morning. He looked at the ledger for a long time. He looked at the 41 photographs. He looked at the routing pattern laid against Callum's 8-month-old audit finding, the 19 phantom guardians, the closure codes, the word disposition, and Malachi Sawande, who had seen a great deal, set down his fork and said quietly, "How many agencies have a piece of this and can't see the whole?" And Callum said, "That's the design. The child leaves foster care in one state. That's one agency, and the file closes. She travels by air. That's a carrier. And to them, she's a UM booking that checked out. She arrives to a guardian with a notarized letter. That's a notary. And to him, it's a signature. She gets adopted privately. That's a family court that never sees it, because the whole point is that it never reaches a court. Nobody has the whole chain, except the person who runs the ledger, and except me, because reconstructing the whole chain from the pieces is the only thing I've ever been good at." Malachi Sawande smiled a hard smile. "Then let's build a chain that ends at Mr. Payne." But Payne moved first, because men like Payne always have one more lever, and Payne's lever was the system itself. 9 days before Bridge 47 was scheduled to fly, A woman from the county's child welfare office knocked on Callum's door during dinner. There had been a report, she said, uncomfortable, professional. An anonymous report expressing concern for the welfare of a minor child in the home, concern about the father's erratic behavior, a late-night incident at the airport involving an unrelated child, and possible instability following the death of the child's mother. She had to follow up. She was sorry. She needed to see Emmy, to look around the home, to ask Emmy some questions alone. Callum understood exactly what it was. It was the frame's second draft. The first draft, deliver a trafficked child to his custody, had failed at the gate. So Payne had reached back into the machine and pulled a different handle. Use the child protective system, the same system that produced his cargo, to declare Callum himself an unfit and unstable father, to put his own daughter's custody in question, to tie him up in a defensive fight for Emmy that would consume every hour he had. It was vicious, and it was smart, because there is no faster way to neutralize a father than to make him fight for his child. A lesser man would have exploded at the caseworker, which was the trap, an erratic outburst to confirm the report. Callum did not explode. He invited her in. He made her tea. He walked her through the time-stamped photographs of Emmy asleep at 11:11 on the night in question. The school folder, the dentist appointment, the fridge calendar, Pauline 2 doors down who had watched Emmy that night and would give a statement. He gave the caseworker, calmly and completely, the audit of his own life. The same defense he'd started building in the first 10 minutes on the phone, the truth densely recorded. And then he said, I want to help you do your job. So I'm going to tell you that this anonymous report was filed by, or on behalf of, the Wayfair Foundation, that it is retaliation for a fraud complaint I've filed against them, and that a federal agent named Malachi Sawande is currently investigating them for trafficking children through the foster system. You should document that I told you this on today's date, because when this is over, the origin of this report is going to be evidence. The caseworker, whose name was Rennell, the same Rennell from the airport, Callum realized, in the small, cruel way these systems overlap, looked at him, and looked at the photograph of a boy coded Bridge 46 that Callum slid across the table, and said, I'll note everything you've told me. And Mr. Alcott, off the record, your daughter is clearly loved. I've seen 1,000 homes. This isn't one I worry about. She closed her folder. The second draft of the frame died on his dining table, and it died because Callum had understood from the first ring of the first phone call that his weapon was going to be documentation, and he had never once stopped documenting. Then he built the trap. It worked, in the end, because Callum did not try to catch Alistair Payne. He tried to catch Payne's system, and he let the system's own rules pull Payne into it. This was the insight that made the whole thing turn. Payne had insulated himself from every operational step. He never signed a manifest. He never notarized a letter. He never met a child at a gate. He had built layers. Marla Duggan at the airline, Byron Teller at the notary desk, Dr. Verona Skaggs with her looping signature, Des Corbett who did the surveillance and the driving, the coordinators like Sabra who booked the flights believing they were doing good. Payne touched none of it, except for one thing. The reason Payne did any of this, the money, required his signature, because the whole point of the operation was not just to move children, but to harvest what the children were worth. The benefits, the trusts, the settlements attached to certain foster children, redirected to shell guardianships, through instruments that, by law, required the Foundation's founding officer to authorize. Sabra found it in the ledger's linked documents, the disposition field for the high-value children, connected to a benefit redirection authorization, and every one of those bore an executed signature block. A. Payne, founder and chief executive. He could delegate the crime. He could not delegate the profit, and the profit was in his own hand. So Callum designed a delivery that would light up every layer at once and put Payne's signature on the fatal document. With Malachi Sawande running it as a federal operation, which meant the bot Sergeant Cask and his airport police fiefdom were cut out entirely, replaced by agents Cask didn't know existed, and with Sabra on the inside booking it, they created Bridge 52. A child who didn't exist, a data ghost of exactly the kind Callum had spent 15 years walking through terminals, but this time built to trigger the money. The ghost was designed as a high-value placement, a foster child with a substantial trust, the kind Payne's operation existed to strip, so that completing the placement would require the benefit redirection authorization. Sabra fed the case into the pipeline the way she'd fed 46 real ones, hating every minute of the performance, doing it because a boy named Bridge 47 was still scheduled to fly, and this was how you stopped him. The layers activated one by one, and each one signed its own name to its own crime. Byron Teller notarized the guardian authorization letter for a child who did not exist, stamping his real commission over a fiction. A federal crime, self-documented. Dr. Verona Skaggs signed a fit-to-travel clearance for a child she had never examined because the child was not real. Her looping V. Skaggs on a fraudulent medical document, self-documented. Marla Duggan, who Callum had by then quietly confronted with the 41 photographs and a choice, cooperate and testify, or be the airline supervisor whose name was on Bridge 46, entered the unaccompanied minor booking into Meridian Air's system and applied a supervisor override to bypass the very guardian verification steps that Callum's audit had recommended, her employee ID timestamped on the override, self-documented. Des Corbett accepted the assignment to receive the child and drive the handoff, and Des Corbett, it turned out, was the man in the dark sedan, the man who had photographed Callum's front step, and when he was arrested, his phone held the original surveillance photos of Callum's house, of Emmy walking to the bus, geotagged and dated, self-documented. And the money, wired from a Wayfair shell entity to complete the placement, moved against a benefit redirection authorization executed because the trust was too valuable to delegate, by A. Payne, founder and chief executive, self-documented, in his own hand, the one signature he had never been able to give to anyone else. The sting came together at Gate B12 because Callum had insisted on it and Malachi had let him because the auditor had earned it. The same dead terminal, the same bank of empty seats where a small girl in a purple coat had held a photograph of a stranger and called him her new dad. This time the child was a ghost, and the seats were empty, and the trap was full. When Des Corbett arrived to accept the handoff, the two young officers who took him down were the same two who had watched their sergeant that first night and started to wonder. Malachi had found them, and they had been waiting for someone to let them be honest. Marla Duggan, wired, walked Corbett through the override at the gate desk, while a federal team recorded every word. And when Sergeant Elmore Cask showed up, unbidden, to secure the scene, the way he'd tried to secure the documents the first night, he walked into a scene secured by people with credentials that outranked his by a wide federal margin, and Callum watched from behind the glass of the jet bridge door as the man's face fell into the specific gray of a corrupt cop, realizing the dark he'd always operated in had, without warning, filled with light. Alistair Payne was not at the airport. Men like Payne are never at the airport. He was at a fundraising dinner, silver-haired and warm, accepting an award for humanitarian service, when Malachi Sawande and 4 other agents came through the ballroom doors. Callum was there too, at the back, because Malachi had asked him to be. "You reconstructed the chain," he'd said. "You should watch it reach the end." Callum did not gloat. He was not built for gloating. He watched Payne's face as the agent leaned down and spoke quietly in his ear, watched the practiced warmth curdle into calculation, and then, when Payne understood the scope, the notary, the doctor, the supervisor, the driver, the ledger, the benefit redirection authorization with his own name executed on it, the wired money, all of it locked and time-stamped and impossible to delegate away, into something that was almost, for one honest second, fear. Payne tried, of course. Men like Payne always try. On his way out, past Callum, he stopped, because someone had told him who Callum was, and he looked at the auditor with the last card he had. "You have a daughter," Payne said softly, pleasantly, the way he'd said everything for 20 years. It would be a shame, after everything, for questions about her welfare to keep coming up. These processes can take years. A man can lose a great deal, fighting to keep his own child, while he's busy trying to save other people's. Callum looked at him, and then Callum took out his phone and turned it around and showed Payne the screen, where the audio had been recording since the agents came through the doors. "Mr. Payne," he said, evenly, kindly, the way you'd correct a customer service agent who'd spelled your name for you. "You just threatened the child of a witness in front of a federal officer, on the record. I want you to understand something. Because I don't think anyone has ever bothered to tell you. I audit handoffs for a living. I spend my whole life proving that when one person hands a human being to another, the handoff was clean. That night you handed me a child like she was contraband, using my name, my address, my face, so I did the only thing I know how to do. I audited you. Every signature, every timestamp, all 51 of them. He put the phone away. Bridge 46's name is Freya. She's going home. You should know their names. You're going to be hearing them for a long time. The unraveling took months, but it took them, all of them. Byron Teller, faced with the notary log the state had never checked, flipped inside a week and gave up the volume of letters he'd stamped. Dr. Verona Skaggs surrendered her license for good and, facing federal charges, testified about the clearances. Marla Duggan's cooperation, Leverage Callum had turned into a witness, mapped the airline side. Sabra Linden's ledger, authenticated and complete, became the spine of the case. 51 bridge numbers that federal and state investigators, working together for the first time because Callum had shown them the whole chain, converted back into 51 children with names, and then went looking for. Most were found, not all. Callum made himself sit with that, the not all, because looking away is how these things survive, and he was not going to become a man who looked away. Alistair Payne was convicted on federal counts of conspiracy, child trafficking, and fraud, and the Wayfair Foundation's assets were frozen and, in a ruling Callum framed and hung in his home office, redirected to the actual trusts of the actual children the foundation had spent a decade stripping. The humanitarian award was quietly rescinded. The Children's Hospital wing kept its name for 11 days and then took it down. Sergeant Elmore Cask took a plea. The anonymous welfare report against Callum was traced, through Des Corbett's phone and a subpoenaed call record, back to the foundation, and became one more count against Payne. The second draft of the frame entered into evidence as proof of the first. The caseworker Rennell testified about the tea Callum had made her and the time-stamped photographs of a sleeping girl. And somewhere in all of it, the two young airport officers who had started to wonder got the quiet commendations of people who had done the right thing at the moment it cost the most. But the part Callum would tell you mattered, the part he'd say if you cornered him, was the handoff. Freya's real name, it turned out, had been buried under 3 layers of closure codes and a file that read adopted internationally. A lie a bureaucrat had signed because it made a hard case disappear. She had a grandmother. Her name was Billy Prosser, and she was 68, and she had spent 2 years and every dollar she had trying to find the granddaughter the county had told her was gone, placed overseas, unreachable, no longer her business. She had never believed it. She had kept Freya's room exactly as it was. And on a bright cold morning in a family court that was, this time, real, with a judge and a record and every signature verified, Callum Alcott, who had been asked to be present because he had reconstructed the chain that made it possible, watched a small girl who had once held a photograph of a stranger and called him her new dad run across a courtroom into the arms of an old woman who was, unmistakably, unfakeably, her own. There was a form. There is always a form. A custody release. A handoff of a minor from the state's care to a verified guardian. The exact kind of document Callum had spent his life making sure was real. The judge asked if there was anyone present qualified to witness the chain of custody, and Malachi Sawande, grinning, pointed at the back of the room. So Callum Alcott stepped up, and he checked the identification against the name, and he confirmed the timestamp, and he signed as witness to the one handoff, out of all the handoffs of his long, careful life, that he would have crawled across broken glass to certify. Then he went home to Emmy, who wanted the growly voice, and who told him it was finally scary enough. Okay, Nathan again. I've told you a lot of stories on this channel, and a fair number of them are about men who win by hitting harder than the people who hurt them. This one stuck with me because Callum wins by refusing to. He wins because from the very first second, a stranger on the phone spelling his own name back at him, he understood that panic is just information you haven't organized yet, and he organized it. He photographed a clock. He made tea for the caseworker sent to destroy him. He turned a trap into a witnessed event, and then turned the whole machine that built it into a document he could read out loud in a federal courtroom. Here's what I keep coming back to. The bad guys in this story didn't hide in the dark. They hid in the light, in charity galas and glossy paperwork, and phrases like placed out of jurisdiction that make a child stop being anyone's problem. The most dangerous lie isn't the one whispered in an alley. It's the one that's notarized. And the reason Alistair Payne almost got away with it forever is that everybody involved could only see their own little piece. One signature, one booking, one closed file. And nobody was willing to do the boring, patient, unglamorous work of reconstructing the whole chain. Callum was. That was the whole superpower. Not fists. Attention. So if you take one thing from tonight, take this. The people who protect the vulnerable are almost never the loudest people in the room. They're the ones quietly writing down the time. They're the ones who ask a frightened child her real name instead of the one she was handed. Pay attention to who keeps the receipts. And if a stranger ever calls you at 11 at night and tells you something that makes your stomach drop, before you do anything else, go check the bedroom, and then start counting the things that don't add up. If you made it to the end, drop the word receipts in the comments so I know who the quiet ones are. Take care of each other. I'll see you in the next one.